Boy gets separated from his family and sneaks into George Strait's dressing room. What he did for the boy moved the entire show. The sweat dripped down Miguel Santos's forehead as he clutched the crumpled concert ticket in his small hands, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. At 12 years old, he had never imagined he would actually be standing outside the massive American Airlines Center in Dallas, Texas, watching thousands of cowboy hat-wearing fans stream through the entrance doors. This wasn't just any concert. This was George Strait, the king of country himself, and Miguel was about to witness something that had been a dream shared between him and his father for as long as he could remember. 3 years had passed since that terrible day when his father, Roberto Santos, had collapsed at the construction site in São Paulo, his heart giving out at the young age of 34. Miguel still remembered every detail of that morning, how his father had hummed Amarillo Morning while getting ready for work, how he had ruffled Miguel's hair and promised they would save enough money to see George Strait perform live in America someday. That someday had seemed impossible then, and even more impossible after Roberto's sudden death left Miguel and his mother, Cecilia, struggling to survive in their small apartment in the outskirts of the city. But Cecilia Santos was not a woman who gave up easily. Standing barely 5 feet tall, with calloused hands from countless hours of cleaning houses, serving tables, and working overnight shifts at a local factory, she had made a promise to her dying husband that she would find a way to fulfill his dream for their son. For 2 years and 4 months, she had worked 3 jobs, sleeping only 4 hours a night, saving every penny she could spare after paying for rent, food, and Miguel's school supplies. "Mijo," she had whispered to Miguel on his 12th birthday. Using the affectionate term Roberto used to call him, "Your papa and I always believed that music heals the soul. Tonight, we're going to heal ours together." That's when she had pulled out the envelope containing 2 airplane tickets to Dallas and the concert passes that had cost her more than 3 months' worth of salary. The journey from São Paulo to Dallas had been Miguel's first time on an airplane, his first time leaving Brazil, and his first real glimpse of hope since his father's death. During the 8-hour flight, Cecilia had told him stories about how Roberto had discovered George Strait's music through an American tourist who had visited their neighborhood. Roberto couldn't speak English, but he had learned every single word to Troubadour by listening to it hundreds of times, writing down the lyrics phonetically in Portuguese letters, and singing along until he could pronounce each word perfectly. "Your father used to say that George Strait sang about real life," Cecilia had explained as the plane descended into Dallas, "about love, loss, hard work, and never giving up on your dreams. He said that someday, when we had enough money, we would bring you to America to see the greatest storyteller in country music." She had paused, wiping away a tear. "He also said that maybe, just maybe, if we were lucky enough, you might even get to shake the man's hand." Now, as Miguel stood in the massive lobby of the arena, surrounded by conversations in rapid English that he could barely follow, he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his mother had sacrificed to make this moment possible. Hey there, wonderful viewers! If you're enjoying Miguel's incredible journey and want to hear how this amazing story unfolds, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We'd love to hear from you in the comments about what you think will happen next, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when Miguel finally comes face to face with his hero. The arena was unlike anything Miguel had ever seen. The ceiling seemed to stretch impossibly high, and everywhere he looked, there were people wearing cowboy boots, western shirts and hats, just like the ones his father had dreamed of owning. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation, and Miguel could feel his father's presence so strongly, it was as if Roberto was walking right beside him. Cecilia had spent weeks before the trip teaching Miguel basic English phrases, but standing In this sea of American voices, he felt small and lost. "Stay close to me, mijo," she said, taking his hand firmly in hers. "We have seats in section 112, row 15. Your papa would be so proud to know we made it this far." Oh. As they made their way through the crowd, Miguel noticed how different everything was from the concerts he had attended in Brazil. The fans here seemed to know every word to every song, even the deep cuts from George Strait's albums from the 1980s. Many of them wore T-shirts with images of the singer, and Miguel spotted several people wearing the exact same style of cowboy hat that George Strait was famous for wearing on stage. Their seats were better than Miguel had expected. They weren't close enough to see George Strait's facial expressions clearly, but they had a perfect view of the entire stage, and the sound system was so crystal clear that Miguel felt like the music was being played directly into his ears. As they settled into their seats, Cecilia pulled out her old smartphone and showed Miguel the video she had saved of Roberto singing Troubadour in their kitchen just a few months before he died. "He practiced this song every single day," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He wanted to be ready in case he ever got the chance to sing along at a concert. Tonight, we sing it for him." The opening act was a young country singer Miguel had never heard of, but the crowd was already energetic and loud. Miguel found himself caught up in the atmosphere, clapping along even though he didn't know the words. But as the minutes ticked by and the anticipation built toward George Strait's entrance, Miguel felt something shifting inside him. This wasn't just about seeing a famous singer perform. This was about connecting with his father's memory in a way that felt real and powerful. When the lights dimmed and the crowd erupted into cheers that seemed to shake the entire building, Miguel knew that the next few hours would change something fundamental inside him. The massive screens on either side of the stage displayed the words, "The King of Country," in bold letters. And then, as if emerging from a dream, George Strait walked onto the stage wearing his signature black cowboy hat, a crisp white shirt, and jeans that looked like they had been perfectly tailored for this exact moment. The crowd's roar was deafening, but Miguel found himself frozen in place, staring at the man his father had idolized for so many years. George Strait looked exactly like he did in the pictures Roberto had collected, but seeing him in person, Miguel realized that the singer possessed something that photographs couldn't capture, a quiet confidence and genuine warmth that radiated even from a distance. "Good evening, Dallas." George Strait's voice boomed through the arena, and the crowd responded with another wave of cheers. "Y'all ready for some real country music tonight?" Miguel felt tears forming in his eyes as George launched into "Here for a Good Time," one of Roberto's favorite songs. He could almost hear his father's voice singing along, and for the first time since Roberto's death, Miguel felt like his papa was truly there with him. The music was louder and more powerful than anything Miguel had ever experienced. And as George moved through song after song, Miguel found himself singing along to the choruses he had memorized from listening to his father's old CDs. But it was during Amarillo morning that everything changed. The song had always been special to Miguel because it was the last one his father had hummed on that final morning, and as George Strait's voice filled the arena with the familiar melody, Miguel felt an overwhelming urge to get closer to the stage. The crowd around him was swaying and singing, and in the midst of all that movement and energy, Miguel made a decision that would alter the course of his entire life. He was going to find a way to get closer to his hero, no matter what it took. As the opening chords of Amarillo Morning filled the massive arena, Miguel felt his father's spirit calling to him with an intensity that was almost physical. This was the song Roberto had hummed every morning while getting dressed for work, the song that had played on repeat in their small kitchen while his father cooked breakfast and dreamed of wide-open Texas skies. Without thinking, Miguel began to move toward the aisle, his eyes fixed on the stage where George Strait stood like a monument to everything his father had believed in. "Miguel, onde você vai?" Cecilia called out in Portuguese, trying to grab his arm, but her voice was completely swallowed by the thunderous sound of 20,000 people singing along to the chorus. Miguel turned back to look at his mother for just a moment, his eyes shining with tears and determination, and mouthed the words, "Para papai," for Papa. Before Cecilia could react or follow him, Miguel had slipped into the crowd and was being carried forward by the wave of bodies moving toward the stage. The crowd during Amarillo morning was unlike anything Miguel had ever experienced. In Brazil, concert audiences could be enthusiastic, but this was something entirely different. It was as if every single person in the arena had been personally touched by George Strait's music and was expressing years of pent-up emotion all at once. Miguel found himself pushed and pulled in different directions as fans swayed to the music, raised their arms in the air, and sang along with voices that ranged from beautiful to completely off-key, but filled with pure joy. At first, Miguel tried to keep track of where his mother was sitting, turning around every few steps to make sure he could still see section 112. But as he moved closer to the stage, the crowd became denser and more chaotic, and soon he realized he had lost sight of his reference point completely. People were taller than him, blocking his view in every direction, and their cowboy hats created a forest of shadows that made it impossible for him to get his bearings. "Excuse me," Miguel tried to say in English to a large man wearing a Texas Rangers jersey, but his voice was so quiet and his accent so thick that the man didn't even hear him. Miguel tried again, this time louder. "Excuse me, sir." But just as the man started to turn around, another surge in the crowd pushed Miguel several feet to the left, separating him from the person he had been trying to talk to. Panic began to set in as Miguel realized he was completely surrounded by strangers and had no idea how to find his way back to his mother. He tried to remember the English phrases Cecilia had taught him during the flight, but his mind was blank with fear. "Help," he managed to whisper, then louder, "Help me, please." But his words were lost in the sea of voices singing along to George Strait's guitar solo. The crowd was moving like a living organism, swaying and pulsing with the rhythm of the music, and Miguel felt like he was drowning in an ocean of denim and leather. He could smell cologne, beer, and the distinctive scent of cowboy boots, and everywhere he looked, he saw faces that were completely absorbed in the performance on stage. These people weren't being deliberately unkind, they simply couldn't hear him over the music and weren't paying attention to the small boy who was struggling to navigate through their midst. "Mamãe!" Miguel called out in Portuguese, forgetting that no one around him would understand. "Mamãe, onde você está?" His voice cracked with fear and desperation, and he felt tears beginning to stream down his face. This was supposed to be the most wonderful night of his life, the fulfillment of his father's dream, and instead it was turning into a nightmare. Miguel tried to push against the crowd, attempting to move back toward where he thought his seat had been, but it was like trying to swim upstream in a river. Every time he took a step backward, the crowd would surge forward again, carrying him further away from safety. He began to feel claustrophobic and dizzy, overwhelmed by the heat of so many bodies pressed together and the deafening volume of the music. As Amarillo Morning reached its climactic final chorus, the crowd's energy reached a fever pitch, and Miguel found himself being pushed toward the side of the arena. He stumbled and nearly fell, but managed to catch himself by grabbing onto someone's belt. The person didn't even notice, completely lost in the music and the moment. That's when Miguel spotted something that looked like salvation. A small opening between the crowd and the wall of the arena, a narrow pathway that seemed to lead away from the chaos. Without hesitation, he squeezed through the gap, grateful to finally have some space to breathe. He found himself in a less crowded area, near the side of the stage, where the music was still loud, but the press of bodies wasn't as overwhelming. For a moment, Miguel felt relief wash over him. He wiped the tears from his face and tried to assess his situation. From this vantage point, he could see that he was much closer to the stage than he had been before, close enough to see the individual. Musicians in George Strait's band, and to notice details like the intricate stitching on the singer's shirt. But as he looked around, trying to figure out how to get back to the main seating area, Miguel realized he might have made his situation worse instead of better. He was standing in what appeared to be a service corridor, a utilitarian space with concrete floors and industrial lighting that was clearly not meant for concert-goers. There were no ushers or security guards in sight, and Miguel couldn't see any obvious way to get back to where the audience was seated. The corridor stretched in both directions, disappearing into shadows, and Miguel had no idea which way would lead him back to safety. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Is anybody there? I need help." But the only response was the distant sound of George Strait launching into his next song, "Check Yes or No," which made Miguel's heart ache with the memory of his father singing along to that same tune while working in their small garden back home in São Paulo. Miguel stood frozen for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. He could attempt to go back the way he had come, but that would mean pushing through the crowd again, and he wasn't sure he could handle that level of chaos and noise. The alternative was to explore the corridor and try to find someone who could help him, but that meant venturing into unknown territory where he might get even more lost. The decision was made for him when he heard voices speaking in rapid English coming from somewhere down the corridor. Miguel couldn't understand most of what they were saying, but he recognized the tone of people who were working and moving with purpose. These had to be arena employees, he reasoned, people who would know how to help him find his mother. He began walking toward the voices, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As he moved further away from the main arena, the music became more muffled, though he could still feel the bass reverberating through the floor and walls. The corridor was longer than he had expected, and Miguel passed several closed doors and branching hallways that only added to his confusion about the layout of the building. The voices were getting clearer now, and Miguel could hear men talking about stage left and equipment and other terms he didn't understand. He rounded a corner and saw two men in black shirts with headsets around their necks, standing near a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Miguel's heart leaped with hope. These were exactly the kind of people who could help him. "Excuse me," Miguel said, approaching the men with as much confidence as he could muster. "I am lost. Can you help me find my mama?" The two men looked down at Miguel with surprise and confusion. They clearly hadn't expected to encounter a 12-year-old boy in this restricted area of the arena. One of them, a heavy-set man with a grey beard, knelt down to Miguel's eye level and spoke in a kind but firm voice. "Son, you're not supposed to be back here. This is a restricted area. How did you get past security?" Miguel's English wasn't sophisticated enough to explain the complex series of events that had led him to this moment, but he tried his best. "I was with my mama watching George Strait. The people were pushing and I got scared. I came this way to find help." The second man, younger with short black hair, spoke into his headset. "We've got a lost kid back here in Corridor C. Looks like he wandered off from the main crowd." He listened to a response that Miguel couldn't hear, then looked back at the boy. "What's your name, kid?" "Miguel Santos. I am from Brazil. My mama is Cecilia Santos. We have seats in section 112. The bearded man stood up and smiled reassuringly. "Okay, Miguel from Brazil. We're going to help you find your mama. But first we need to get you back to the right area. You can't be wandering around back here. It's dangerous, and there are a lot of people working who could accidentally run into you." But just as the man reached out to guide Miguel back toward the main arena, there was a commotion from somewhere deeper in the corridor. Miguel could hear someone shouting, and one of the men's headsets crackled with urgent-sounding messages. The bearded man pressed his hand to his earpiece and listened intently. "We've got a medical emergency in Section 205, he said. To his colleague, "They need all available personnel up there right now." Both men looked torn between helping Miguel and responding to what sounded like a serious situation. The younger man spoke quickly into his headset, asking for instructions, while the bearded man looked down at Miguel with obvious concern. "Son, I hate to do this, but we've got an emergency we need to respond to. I need you to stay right here. Don't move from this spot, and someone will be back to help you in just a few minutes. Can you do that for me?" Miguel nodded, though he felt a fresh wave of panic at the thought of being left alone again. The two men hurried off toward the main arena, their urgent voices fading as they disappeared around the corner. Miguel found himself standing alone in the corridor, surrounded by concrete walls and industrial lighting, with nothing but the distant sound of George Strait's music to keep him company. But Miguel Santos had not traveled thousands of miles from Brazil to give up when things got difficult. His father had taught him that real men face their problems head-on, and his mother had shown him that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Instead of waiting helplessly for someone to return, Miguel decided to continue looking for help on his own. He began walking deeper into the corridor, past doors marked with signs he couldn't read, past equipment rooms and storage areas that hummed with electrical noise. The music was fainter now, but Miguel could still make out the melody of "All My Exes Live in Texas," another song his father had loved to sing while driving their old car through the streets of São Paulo. As Miguel walked, he began to notice that some of the doors had more elaborate signs than others. Most were plain and utilitarian, but a few had decorative elements that suggested they might be offices or special rooms. Miguel was looking for anyone who might be able to help him, but he was also secretly hoping that he might encounter someone connected to George Strait himself, maybe a band member or someone who worked directly with the singer. That's when he saw it, a door that was different from all the others. It was painted black instead of the institutional beige of the other doors, and in the center was a gold star about the size of Miguel's hand. Miguel didn't know what the star meant, but something about it seemed important and official. If anyone behind that door could help him, they would probably be someone with authority and knowledge about how the arena worked. Miguel approached the door and stood in front of it for a moment, gathering his courage. He could hear voices from inside, though they were muffled and he couldn't make out the words. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it to knock, but he thought about his father's courage in coming to a foreign country to work construction, and his mother's determination in working 3 jobs to bring him to this concert. He knocked 3 times, softly but clearly. The voices inside the room stopped abruptly, and Miguel heard footsteps approaching the door. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and he took a deep breath, preparing to explain his situation to whoever opened the door. The door handle turned, and Miguel found himself looking up at a man who seemed familiar, but whom he couldn't quite place in the dim lighting of the corridor. The man was tall and lean, wearing jeans and a white shirt, and there was something about his posture and the way he held himself that reminded Miguel of the cowboys in the movies his father used to watch. "Can I help you, son?" the man asked, and Miguel's world suddenly stopped spinning. The voice was unmistakable, even though Miguel had only heard it amplified through arena speakers. Standing in front of him, in a simple white shirt and jeans, with his signature black cowboy hat resting on a nearby chair, was George Strait himself. The king of country was looking down at Miguel with genuine concern in his eyes, apparently having stepped away from what looked like a backstage area to answer the unexpected knock at his dressing room door. Miguel's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, no sound emerging. Every English word his mother had taught him during their flight to Dallas evaporated from his mind in an instant. He was standing face to face with the man his father had idolized, the singer whose voice had filled their small apartment in Sao Paulo every morning for as long as Miguel could remember, and all he could do was stare with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Son, are you okay?" George asked again, this time kneeling down to Miguel's eye level. His voice carried the same gentle warmth that came through in his ballads, but there was also immediate concern for the obviously distressed child who had somehow found his way to his private dressing room. Behind George, Miguel could see several other people beginning to take notice of the situation. A large man in a black suit, who was clearly security personnel, was already moving toward the door, speaking rapidly into a small microphone attached to his collar. A woman with a clipboard and headset looked up from papers she had been reviewing, her expression shifting from annoyance to alarm as she realized an unauthorized person had somehow breached their carefully controlled environment. "Sir, step away from the child," the security guard said firmly, his hand moving to George's shoulder to guide him back. "We'll handle this situation. Kid probably slipped past the perimeter during the crowd surge on Amarillo morning. They happen sometimes when people get too excited." But George remained kneeling, his eyes fixed on Miguel's face. There was something in the boy's expression that went beyond simple fan excitement or even the fear of being lost. George had been performing for decades, had met thousands of fans of all ages, and he had developed an instinct for reading people's emotions. What he saw in Miguel's eyes was a deep sadness mixed with desperate hope, the look of someone who had traveled much, further than just through the arena corridors, to reach this moment. "Wait a minute, Jake," George said to the security guard, holding up his hand. "Let me talk to him first." He turned back to Miguel, his voice becoming even gentler. "What's your name, son?" Miguel swallowed hard, forcing himself to find his voice. "Miguel," he whispered, then louder. "Miguel Santos. I am from Brazil." "Brazil?" George's eyebrows raised with surprise. "That's a long way to come for a concert. Are you here with your family?" The question seemed to unlock something in Miguel, and suddenly the words came pouring out in a mixture of English and Portuguese, his accent thick with emotion. "Yes, sir, Mr. Strait. I came with my mama, Cecilia. We saved money for 2 years to come here because my papa died 3 years ago, and he loved your music so much. He used to sing troubadour every day while he worked, and he promised we would see you together someday. But then he died, and my mama, she worked 3 jobs to bring me here because she said we had to finish Papa's dream." The dressing room fell completely silent. The security guard stopped reaching for Miguel. The woman with the clipboard lowered her papers, and even the background noise of the arena seemed to fade away. George Strait remained kneeling in front of Miguel, but something in his expression had shifted dramatically. The polite concern of a performer meeting a fan had transformed into something much deeper and more personal. "Your father passed away?" George asked quietly. Miguel nodded, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "He was working construction, and his heart stopped. He was only 34 years old, but before he died, he used to play your songs every morning. He said that someday, when we had enough money, we would come to America and see the greatest storyteller in country music. He said maybe, if we were very lucky, I might even get to shake your hand." George was quiet for a long moment, his own eyes beginning to show signs of moisture. Behind him, Miguel could see the other people in the room, exchanging glances, clearly moved by the boy's story, but also aware that George had to return to the stage soon for the encore portion of his show. "Miguel," George said finally, "how did you end up back here? This area is restricted. You shouldn't be able to get past security." Miguel quickly explained about getting separated from his mother during Amarillo morning, about wandering into the service corridor while looking for help, and about the security guards who had been called away to handle an emergency. As he told the story, Miguel kept glancing nervously at the other people in the room, clearly aware that he was in serious trouble for being in a place where he didn't belong. "Sir," the security guard named Jake interrupted, "we really need to get this kid back to the family services desk so they can reunite him with his mother. And you need to be back on stage in 15 minutes for the cowboy rides away." George stood up slowly, his mind clearly working through the situation. Miguel watched his hero's face, trying to read the expression of the man who had unknowingly been a part of his family's life for so many years. He was prepared to be escorted out, to be returned to the lost and found like a misplaced piece of luggage, to have this incredible moment end as quickly as it had begun. Instead, George did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Jake, call family services and let them know we've found Miguel. Tell them his mother's name is Cecilia Santos, and she's in section 112. But don't bring her back here yet." George paused, looking down at Miguel with an expression that was impossible to read. "I want to talk to Miguel a little bit more first." The woman with the clipboard, who Miguel now realized must be some kind of manager or assistant, stepped forward. "George, we really don't have time for this. The crowd is expecting you back on stage, and the production schedule is already running behind because of the technical issues during sound check." "Linda, the crowd can wait a few more minutes," George replied, his voice carrying an authority that made it clear the discussion was over. "This young man traveled 4,000 miles to be here tonight. I think we can spare him a few minutes of our time." Miguel felt his heart racing with disbelief. Not only was he having a conversation with George Strait, but the singer was actually choosing to spend extra time with him instead of rushing back to perform for 20,000 people. This was beyond his wildest dreams, beyond even what his father had imagined when he talked about maybe getting to shake the famous singer's hand. "Miguel," George said, sitting down in a chair so that he was closer to the boy's height, "tell me more about your father. What was his name?" "Roberto Santos," Miguel replied, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "He came to Brazil from Portugal when he was young, looking for work. He met my mama at a church dance, and they fell in love listening to American country music on an old radio. Papa said that country music was the same in any language because it was about real feelings and real life." George nodded slowly. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man. What kind of work did he do?" "Construction. He built houses for rich people in São Paulo. He worked very hard, 12 hours every day, but he always came home singing your songs. His favorite was Troubadour because he said it was about never giving up on your dreams, even when you get older." Miguel's voice became stronger as he talked about his father, the fear and nervousness being replaced by pride and love. "He used to say that you sang about the kind of man he wanted to be, honest, hard-working, and faithful to his family." The room was completely silent except for the distant sound of the crowd chanting, "George, George, George," from the arena. Miguel could see that his words were having a profound effect on the singer, though he didn't understand why. What Miguel couldn't know was that George Strait had lost his own son Bubba in a car accident years before, and that the pain of that loss had never fully healed. Hearing about Roberto's dreams and seeing Miguel's courage in the face of his own loss was touching something deep in George's heart. "Miguel," George said slowly, "you said your father used to sing Troubadour. Do you know the words to that song?" Miguel nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Papa taught me every word. He said that someday, if we ever met you, maybe I could sing it with him, but now..." Miguel's voice trailed off as he realized that dream could never come true. George was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing a decision that would affect more than just the next few minutes. The crowd's chanting was getting louder, and Miguel could see the other people in the room becoming more agitated about the delay. But George seemed to be somewhere else entirely, lost in thoughts that Miguel couldn't begin to understand. Finally, George looked directly into Miguel's eyes with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. "Miguel, I know this might sound crazy, and I know your father isn't here with us tonight, but what if I told you there was a way we could still honor his dream? What if there was a way for you to sing Troubadour the way your father always imagined you would?" Miguel's heart stopped. "What do you mean, Mr. Strait?" George stood up and walked to the mirror where his black cowboy hat was resting. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, as if the hat might contain the answer to a question he was still formulating. The room was so quiet that Miguel could hear his own breathing. "Miguel," George said finally, "how would you feel about coming on stage with me to sing Troubadour for 20,000 people? We could sing it for your father, so he knows that his dream came true after all." The offer hung in the air like something impossible and magical. Miguel stared at George Strait with complete disbelief, certain that he had misunderstood or that this was some kind of elaborate dream. Behind George, he could see Jake, the security guard, shaking his head frantically, and Linda, the manager, looking like she was about to have a heart attack. "Sir," Linda said urgently, "you can't be serious. We have insurance liability issues, union regulations about unauthorized performers, and the production crew has no idea how to handle this kind of change to the show. The legal department alone would have our heads if something went wrong." But George wasn't listening to the practical concerns. He was watching Miguel's face, seeing the same mixture of hope and disbelief that he had felt as a young man when he first stepped onto a stage and realized that music had the power to heal wounds that nothing else could touch. "Miguel," George asked gently, "what do you think your father would want you to do?" Miguel closed his eyes and tried to imagine Roberto's voice, tried to feel his father's presence in this impossible moment. When he opened his eyes again, they were shining with determination and love. "Papa would want me to be brave," Miguel said quietly. "He always said that when life gives you a chance to make something beautiful, you should never be afraid to take it." George smiled for the first time since Miguel had knocked on his door, and in that smile, Miguel could see the same warmth and authenticity that had made his father fall in love with country music all those years ago. "Then let's go make something." "Beautiful," George said, placing his black cowboy hat on Miguel's head. The moment George's hat settled onto Miguel's small head, the dressing room erupted into chaos. Linda, the tour manager, immediately stepped between George and Miguel, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. "George, you cannot be serious about this. Do you have any idea what kind of liability nightmare this creates? We have no clearance from the venue, no approval from the insurance company, and absolutely no protocol for bringing an unauthorized minor onto the stage during a live performance." Jake, the security chief, was already speaking rapidly into his headset, trying to get guidance from the arena's management team. "Control, this is Jake in the artist area. We have a code yellow situation developing. The headliner wants to bring an unregistered audience member on stage. I need immediate consultation with legal and venue management." But George Strait had not become the king of country music by being easily deterred. He had built his career on trusting his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that this moment with Miguel was more important than any insurance policy or corporate protocol. The boy standing in front of him, wearing a hat that was far too large for his 12-year-old head, represented something that George had thought he might never find again. The pure, uncomplicated joy that music could bring to people who truly needed it. "Linda, Jake, I appreciate your concerns, but I'm going to do this," George said with quiet authority. "Miguel came 4,000 miles to be here tonight because his father believed that music could change people's lives. I'm not going to let paperwork and liability fears prevent us from proving that his father was right." "George, please think about this rationally," Linda pleaded. "The production crew has no time to set up an additional microphone or adjust the sound levels. The lighting director doesn't know where to focus the spots. The camera operators haven't been briefed on shooting a duet with a child. This could be a technical disaster that ruins the entire show." Miguel stood frozen in the middle of the argument, George's hat sliding down over his eyebrows, feeling like he was watching his dream slip away before it had even begun. He could see the genuine concern in the faces of George's team, and he began to understand that his presence was creating serious problems for people who were just trying to do their jobs properly. "Mr. Strait," Miguel said quietly, "maybe they are right. Maybe this is too difficult. I do not want to cause trouble for you." George knelt down in front of Miguel again, adjusting the hat so the boy could see clearly. "Miguel, let me tell you something about trouble. Real trouble is when a 12-year-old boy has to grow up without his father. Real trouble is when a mother has to work 3 jobs just to keep a promise to her dead husband. What we're talking about here isn't trouble. It's just people being afraid of doing something that hasn't been done before." The conviction in George's voice seemed to quiet some of the protests from his team, but Linda made one final attempt to change his mind. "George, even if we could solve all the technical issues, we still have the legal problem. The boy's mother isn't even here to give consent. We could be looking at kidnapping charges if this goes wrong." That comment hit George like a physical blow, because it reminded him of the real-world implications of his impulsive decision. Miguel was indeed a minor child who was currently separated from his legal guardian, and taking him on stage without explicit parental permission could create exactly the kind of legal nightmare that Linda was describing. But before George could respond, Jake's headset crackled with an urgent message that changed everything. "Jake, this is Control. We've got the boy's mother at the family services desk. She's been looking for him for the past 20 minutes, and she's extremely distraught. She doesn't speak much English, but she's asking for her son Miguel, and she keeps saying something about George Strait." George stood up immediately. "Bring her back here. Right now." "Sir, we can't bring audience members into the artist area," Jake protested. "It's against every security protocol we have." "Jake," George said with steel in his voice, "you're going to bring Miguel's mother back here, and you're going to do it in the next 3 minutes, or I'm going to walk out on this stage and tell 20,000 people that my security team prevented a grieving mother from being reunited with her lost son. How do you think that's going to play in the media?" The threat was effective. Jake spoke into his headset again, this time with clear instructions for the family services team to escort Cecilia Santos to the artist area immediately. As they waited, George turned his attention to the technical challenges that Linda had raised. "Linda, get on the radio to Tommy in sound engineering. Tell him we need a wireless microphone set up stage left, adjusted for a 12-year-old's height and vocal range. Get Bobby in lighting to add a soft spot to illuminate that area. And tell the camera crew they're going to get some footage tonight that will make this show legendary." Linda stared at George for a moment, then shook her head with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You're absolutely insane, you know that? But if we're really doing this, I need 5 minutes to coordinate with the crew." She spoke into her own headset, rattling off instructions in the rapid-fire terminology that concert professionals used to communicate complex technical requirements in minimal time. Miguel watched the flurry of activity around him with growing amazement. These people were actually going to make it possible for him to sing with George Strait on stage. The impossibility of the situation was beginning to sink in, and he felt a mixture of excitement and terror that made his hands shake and his stomach flutter with nervous energy. "Miguel," George said, sitting down beside the boy, "while we're waiting for your mother to get here, let's talk about what's going to happen when we go on stage. Have you ever performed in front of people before?" Miguel nodded. "Yes, sir. At church I sang in the children's choir, and at school I was in a play about Brazilian independence, but never in front of so many people and never in English." "The size of the audience doesn't matter," George assured him. "When you're singing a song that means something to you, it's just like singing in your living room. The people out there want you to succeed. They're not hoping you'll fail. They came here tonight to feel something real, and that's exactly what you're going to give them." Before Miguel could ask more questions, they heard voices approaching from the corridor. Jake appeared in the doorway, followed by a woman in arena security uniform, who was escorting a small, dark-haired woman whose eyes were red from crying. Miguel's heart leaped when he saw his mother. "Mamãe!" Miguel called out, running to Cecilia and throwing his arms around her. She held him tight, speaking rapidly in Portuguese, her relief at finding him safe overwhelming her ability to speak. "English. Mijó, onde você estava? Eu pensei que tinha perdido você para sempre," she said, tears streaming down her face. Then she looked up and saw George Strait standing a few feet away, and her expression changed to one of complete shock. George approached, slowly removing his backup hat in a gesture of respect. "Mrs. Santos, my name is George Strait. Your son found his way to my dressing room while he was looking for help after you two got separated. He's told me about your family's journey here tonight and about his father Roberto. I want you to know that Miguel is a remarkably brave young man." Cecilia stared at George for a moment, then looked down at Miguel, who was still wearing George's signature black hat. She spoke to Miguel in Portuguese, asking him to explain what was happening. Miguel's response was animated and excited, and even though George couldn't understand the words, he could hear the joy and anticipation in the boy's voice. "Mrs. Santos," George continued, "Miguel has told me about his father's love for my music, and about the dream you all shared of coming to see me perform. I know this might sound unusual, but I would like to invite Miguel to join me on stage tonight to sing one of his father's favorite songs. However, I need your permission before we can do that." Cecilia looked confused, and Miguel quickly translated George's words into Portuguese. As the meaning became clear, Cecilia's eyes widened with disbelief. She looked back and forth between George and Miguel, as if trying to determine whether this was real or some kind of elaborate dream. "Ele quer que eu cante no palco com ele?" Miguel asked his mother in Portuguese. "Para papai!" Cecilia's hands flew to her mouth, and fresh tears began to flow down her cheeks. She spoke to Miguel again, this time more slowly, asking questions that Miguel answered with growing excitement. Finally, she turned back to George and attempted to speak in her limited English. "Mr. Strait, you are very kind man. Roberto, my husband, he love your music more than anything. He always say that you sing about real life, about working hard and loving family. If you want Miguel to sing with you." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "It would make Roberto's spirit very happy." George felt a lump forming in his throat. "Mrs. Santos, I want you to understand that this is completely safe. Miguel will be right beside me the entire time, and my security team will be watching everything. But if you have any concerns we don't have to do this." Cecilia shook her head firmly. No concerns. Miguel is good singer like his papa. And Roberto always say that when God gives you a chance to make something beautiful, you must be brave enough to take it. The phrase was almost identical to what Miguel had said earlier, and George realized that Roberto's wisdom lived on in both his wife and his son. "Then we're going to make something beautiful together," George said. Linda's voice crackled through the dressing room speakers. "George, we've got everything set up on stage. Wireless mic is tested and ready. Lighting is programmed, and the crew knows what's happening. But we need you out there in 60 seconds for the encore." George looked at Miguel, who was nervously adjusting the cowboy hat on his head. "Are you ready, partner?" Miguel took a deep breath, thinking about his father's courage in leaving Portugal for Brazil, his mother's determination in working 3 jobs, and his own journey from their small apartment in Sao Paulo to this incredible moment in Dallas, Texas. "Yes, sir. I am ready to sing for Papa." George extended his hand to Miguel, and together they walked toward the door that would lead them to the stage. Behind them, Cecilia followed, escorted by Jake and Linda, while the technical crew made final adjustments to accommodate the most unusual duet in country music history. As they approached the stage entrance, George could hear the crowd chanting his name with increasing intensity. In just a few moments, he would walk out there and introduce Miguel to 20,000 people who had no idea they were about to witness something unprecedented. The boy beside him was about to fulfill his father's dream in a way that neither Roberto nor Miguel could have ever imagined. "Miguel," George said as they reached the wings of the stage, "your father would be very proud of you tonight." Miguel looked up at his hero, the man whose music had been the soundtrack to his father's life, and smiled with the kind of pure confidence that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be. "I think Papa is watching us right now," Miguel replied, and as the stage lights blazed to life and George Strait's name was announced to the thunderous crowd, Miguel Santos from Sao Paulo, Brazil, prepared to step into the spotlight and sing, his heart out for his father, his hero, and 20,000 strangers who were about to fall in love with a 12-year-old boy's courage. The roar that greeted George Strait as he walked onto the stage was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the collective gasp that followed when the crowd realized he wasn't alone. Walking beside the King of Country, wearing an oversized black cowboy hat that nearly covered his eyes, was a small boy who looked completely out of place and yet somehow perfectly right in that moment. George approached the microphone at center stage, raising his hand to quiet the confused but curious crowd. The arena fell into an expectant hush, 20,000 people sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. Miguel stood slightly behind George, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone in the first 10 rows could hear it. "Good evening, Dallas," George began, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had made him a legend. "Before we wrap up tonight's show, I want to introduce you to a very special young man who reminded me why we're all here. This is Miguel Santos, and he's 12 years old. He traveled here from Brazil with his mother, Cecilia, to fulfill a promise they made to Miguel's father, Roberto, who passed away 3 years ago." The arena was completely silent now, the kind of profound quiet that only occurs when thousands of people are collectively holding their breath. Miguel could feel the weight of all those eyes on him, but instead of being frightened, he felt his father's presence surrounding him like a protective embrace. "Roberto Santos was a construction worker in Sao Paulo," George continued, "and he was one of the biggest country music fans you'll ever hear about. He used to sing my songs every morning while getting ready for work, and he dreamed of bringing his son to America to see a real country show. Roberto never got that chance, but Miguel and his mother Cecilia saved up for over 2 years, working multiple jobs to make that dream come true. Miguel could see people in the front rows wiping their eyes, and he noticed that many of the tough-looking cowboys in the audience were leaning forward with expressions of genuine interest and sympathy. The story was resonating with them in a way that Miguel hadn't expected. Now, Miguel got separated from his mother during Amarillo morning. "Y'all were pretty excited during that one," George said with a slight smile, which drew some nervous laughter from the crowd. "And in looking for help, he somehow found his way to my dressing room. When I met this young man, he told me that his father's favorite song was Troubadour, and that Roberto had always hoped Miguel might someday get to sing it with me. George turned to look at Miguel, his expression conveying both encouragement and profound respect. Miguel asked me if we could sing that song together tonight, for his father's memory. And I can't think of any better way to end this show than by honoring a man who understood that country music is about real life, real emotions, and dreams that don't die, even when we do. The crowd erupted into applause, but it wasn't the wild, celebratory cheering that had greeted George's entrance. This was something deeper and more meaningful, the sound of thousands of people expressing their support for a grieving boy who was about to do something incredibly brave. George gestured for Miguel to step forward to the microphone that the sound crew had positioned stage left. As Miguel walked across the stage, adjusting George's hat on his head, the applause grew louder and more sustained. People were standing up throughout the arena, creating a wave of support that washed over Miguel and filled him with confidence he didn't know he possessed. "Before we sing," George said into his microphone, "I want Miguel to say hello to y'all himself." Miguel approached the microphone with trembling hands, but when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "Hello, Dallas," he said, his Brazilian accent adding a charming lilt to the words. "My name is Miguel Santos, and I want to thank Mr. George Strait for being so kind to me tonight. My papa always said that country music brings people together, no matter where they come from. Tonight, I sing for my papa, for my mama Cecilia, who is watching from backstage, and for all of you who came here to feel something real." The crowd's response was overwhelming. People were cheering, whistling, and calling out encouragement in English and Spanish. Miguel could see cowboy hats being raised in salute throughout the arena, and he realized that these weren't just George Strait fans anymore. They were his fans too, at least for the next few minutes. George's band, who had been quietly informed about the duet during Miguel's conversation with his mother, began the gentle opening chords of Troubadour. The song started slowly, with just acoustic guitar and pedal steel, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the massive venue. George began singing the first verse in his distinctive voice, the words flowing over the arena like a gentle river. "I still feel 25 most of the time. I still raise a little cane with the boys, honky-tonks and pretty women. Lord, I'm still right there with them, singing above the crowd and the noise." As the song progressed toward the chorus, George nodded to Miguel, indicating it was time for them to sing together. Miguel stepped closer to the microphone, took a deep breath, and joined his voice with his heroes. "Sometimes I feel like Jesse James, still trying to make a name, knowing nothing's going to change what I am. I was a young troubadour when I rode in on a song, and I'll be an old troubadour when I'm gone." Miguel's voice was pure and clear, with the natural vibrato that comes from genuine emotion rather than vocal training. The combination of his youthful tone with George's seasoned baritone created something magical, a blend that spoke to both the innocence of dreams and the wisdom that comes from loss. As they moved through the second verse, Miguel's confidence grew. He could feel his father's presence more strongly than ever, as if Roberto was standing right beside him, singing along just like he used to do in their kitchen back in Sao Paulo. The words of the song, about staying young in spirit despite the passage of time, seemed to perfectly capture everything Roberto had believed about life and music. During the final chorus, George stepped back slightly, allowing Miguel's voice to take the lead. The boy sang with a passion and authenticity that moved even the most hardened members of the audience to tears. This wasn't a polished performance by a professional entertainer. This was a son honoring his father's memory in the most public and vulnerable way possible. "Sometimes I feel like Jesse James, still trying to make a name, knowing nothing's gonna change what I am." I was a young troubadour when I rode in on a song, and I'll be an old troubadour when I'm gone. As the song reached its conclusion, Miguel sang the final line alone, his voice soaring over the arena with pure emotion. Yes, I'll be an old troubadour when I'm gone. The silence that followed lasted for what felt like an eternity. 20,000 people sat in stunned appreciation of what they had just witnessed. Then, starting from the front rows and spreading throughout the entire arena like wildfire, the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. People were crying openly, applauding with an intensity that Miguel had never imagined possible. He could see grown men wiping their eyes, women holding their hands over their hearts, and children pointing at him with expressions of wonder and admiration. The noise was overwhelming, but it was the sound of pure love and appreciation. George placed his hand on Miguel's shoulder and leaned into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Miguel Santos, singing for his father, Roberto, and reminding all of us why music matters. The ovation continued for several more minutes before George was able to quiet the crowd enough to speak again. Miguel, your father would be incredibly proud of you tonight. You've shown all of us what courage looks like, and you've honored his memory in the most beautiful way possible. Miguel looked up at George with tears in his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Strait. This was the best night of my whole life. George knelt down, so he was at Miguel's eye level, just as he had in the dressing room, but this time in front of 20,000 witnesses. He carefully removed the black cowboy hat from Miguel's head and placed it permanently in the boy's hands. Miguel, I want you to keep this hat. Every time you wear it, I want you to remember that your father's dreams came true tonight and that music really can heal any broken heart. But George wasn't finished. As the crowd watched in amazement, he spoke into the microphone again. Miguel, I know you and your mother are planning to fly back to Brazil tomorrow, but I'd like to invite you both to stay in America for another week as my guests. I have 3 more shows on this tour, and I'd like you to sing Troubadour with me at each one. What do you say? Miguel's mouth fell open with shock. 3 more concerts, 3 more chances to sing with George Strait, 3 more opportunities to honor his father's memory? Yes, sir, he managed to whisper, then louder. Yes, sir, we would love that very much. The crowd erupted again, this time with the wild celebration that comes from witnessing something truly extraordinary. As George and Miguel took their final bow together, Miguel clutched the black cowboy hat to his chest and looked up toward the arena ceiling, certain that somewhere beyond those lights, Roberto Santos was applauding louder than anyone. Later, that night, in a quiet hotel room paid for by George Strait's tour, Miguel called his extended family in São Paulo to tell them about the most incredible evening of his life. Cecilia sat beside him, still in disbelief about everything that had happened, holding a signed photograph that George had given her along with a promise that Miguel would receive a full scholarship to a music school in Nashville if he ever decided he wanted to pursue singing professionally. As Miguel drifted off to sleep that night, still wearing George Strait's cowboy hat, he whispered a prayer of gratitude to his father. Roberto's dream hadn't just come true. It had exceeded anything either of them could have ever imagined. Moon, 12-year-old boy from Brazil, had reminded 20,000 people and millions more who would watch the video online that music truly can bridge any gap, heal any wound, and make any dream possible. The little boy who had gotten lost in a crowd had found something much more valuable than his way back to his seat. He had found his voice, his courage, and the unshakable knowledge that his father's love would guide him through any challenge life might bring. Roberto Santos's dream had become reality, and Miguel Santos's life had been changed forever by the kindness of a country music legend who understood that sometimes the most important performances happen not because they're planned, but because they're necessary.